Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Cameron and I help lead the Salesforce Marketing Cloud Developers Group. This morning, we're doing Marketing Cloud security tips to empower security-minded champions. And we've got a great cast and we've also got a great audience. So thank you for making the time to come along and have a look at this event and to learn.
All right, guys, let's kick off. So, first thing first, a little word about myself. I'm a marketing cloud developer from Brussels, Belgium, working for a big energy company as an in-house employee here in Belgium called NG Electrabel. And as far as my marketing cloud credentials go, you may know me by my blog, which is amscript.xyz, and where I share my knowledge about AMScript and server-side JavaScript. You can see my posts everywhere on LinkedIn. I also recently launched another website, which is called ssgsdocs.xyz, which consists basically of server-side JavaScript snippets and documentation for marketing cloud developers. And I will just stop there. I'm a front-end developer, graphic designer, but that's besides the point. Let's go to the security tips. So I have kind of three big tips, and I will talk about the first one in detail. So when I joined the security guild at my company, what I first learned is this: ask yourself the question, who has access? So in Marketing Cloud, we work basically, normally as a team, right? There's a lot of people, a lot of different roles, a lot of people, different skills, which means that people may, mess up things, right? That extension can be deleted, cloud pages can be deleted, assets can be deleted, etc. And unfortunately for us, Marketing Cloud does not have a versioning tool. So first thing to do is, of course, to check the user permissions, right? And try to grant access to different applications to the people with the right responsibilities. Okay, but that thing is, it exists, but it might not be enough because sometimes people need those accesses, even though it's for limited usage only, etc., etc. So what should we do when people have access to that extension, can mess it up, or I don't know, some assets on Content Builder, cloud pages, etc. So let me talk about, for example, the data extension. So data extensions, the first rule that I always apply is just try not to store any passwords, at least in clear text in data extensions, right? So encrypt it first using encrypt symmetric unscript methods, then modify the control policy so that that extension cannot be deleted. And as a last step and a ninja move, what you can do is basically delete the association with the folder. In that way, the data extension will not appear in the contact builder Marketing Cloud at all, and you will be the only person that knows that that data extension exists, right? And you can do it with server-side JavaScript. I described how to do this on my blog, among other things. Then the content builder. Well, the content builder now, thankfully, has a bin. So when we delete something, it goes into a bin, and we basically don't lose it. But there are multiple ways of storing different assets in the content builder. So you would be tempted to store there something like a PDF, something that can identify the customer, some sensitive data. Well, one thing to remember there is that, in Content Builder, every time you create an asset, you create a public link, which means that whoever has access to the public link, basically has access to the asset. So I do not recommend keeping any customer-related data in Content Builder. Because of that reason, I would recommend having another DAM as a third-party application or a server to host those kind of data or files, etc. And then finally, for the cloud pages, you will find a lot of developers suggesting to accelerate development. You can use, Dropbox, Google Drive, some other services to basically serve the pages, and that way you can accelerate the development, etc. But again, ask yourself the question: the link that you create to your page, is it publicly accessible? For Google Drive or Dropbox, it will be. For GitHub, you can make it more secure. In fact, in GitHub, what you can do now is to create a private repository. And to access that private repository, you can generate a personal access token and provide it in Marketing Cloud. And using that access token, it will add an extra layer of security for your page. But again, this kind of server kind of third-party applications should only be used for development. There's a very nice article about this written like a couple of years ago by Sandeep Bansal, how to implement GitHub on your cloud pages or emails, etc. You should totally read it. Now, the tip number 2, use deep links to grant access to sensitive data. So basically, sometimes what you need to do is to create a link to, for example, a cloud page. So from your email, you want to access a cloud page, but on that cloud page, it might be some sensitive data. So you don't necessarily want this link to be active all the time, because guess what? All of our emails, as soon as they arrive in the mailbox of the person, they can be crawled. They can be crawled by bots, by an antivirus, by something. So basically the content of the email itself can be stolen. So all of those links in your email can basically wind up on some third-party application somewhere there. So in this case, what is most important is make sure that your link does not work after, some amount of action after some time. And what I'm talking about here in particular is time and accessibility. For example, how many times a link can be clicked before it expires, or when does this link expire? Does it expire after 24 hours? Does it expire by default after, I don't know, 90 days, like it is in Marketing Cloud, right? So those things you can define. I wrote an article about it a while back, but basically you would use a method like Cloud Pages URL or something like encrypt symmetric to encode as a parameter a date in your link, and on the cloud page or a page between the link and the cloud page, you can actually count the number of clicks. And then if, for example, you understand that the link has been clicked more than 3 times, so disable the link or redirect the person to another website. All right, so my tip number 3, personalization in emails. It sounds like a good idea, right? But there is one thing that you need to keep in mind, is that by default, in like Marketing Cloud emails, you have this link. I believe in different applications it's called differently. In Smart Focus, for example, it's called a mirror link. In Marketing Cloud, I usually call it quote unquote view in browser link, right? And this is a link that leads from your email to basically a copy of your email, but in the form of a cloud page, right? And what I would suggest is never leave it in a commercial email or transactional email. So as a matter of fact, forget about this, remove it from everywhere. Why do I talk about this? Because we found out on this particular website, urlscan.io, that you can actually find those links and access the data of the customers through that third-party website. We don't really know how it gets there. It gets there through an API. I personally believe it gets through some antivirus process or something like that. But I invite you to make a test yourself. Just type HTTPS, etc., view dot, and then your domain and your domain extension. And the chances are you will find, if you use view in browser links, some of your content there. So my suggestion is don't use personal information of your customers in emails that have that link, or just don't use that link at all, so that it doesn't get leaked, so that your customers will not complain, basically. What personalization, in my humble opinion, should be is how you personalize the content to the user. If you decide to show a different offer, a different image, something related to the preference of the user, but not the customer information. Like first name is all right. first name, last name, already that's a stretch, right? And then if you have the address and you have everything, then you open the door to social engineering and a whole bunch of trouble. So this was my last tip of the day. Thank you.
Hello. How is everyone? So my name is Surico. I am currently mostly a front-end Salesforce Marketing Cloud expert. I've worked in all of the Salesforce tools, so I have a lot of information regarding, multi-platform use, especially with Marketing Cloud. And it's a tool that I've grown to love. And so in my position as a marketer, we're always, finding ways to enhance our product as well as keep out the bots. So my presentation today will be some tips to mitigate bot attacks. Unfortunately, it does happen. You can have the best website, you can be the best company in the world or the best institution, and people will want to get your data. So here are some tips on how to combat that. So we'll just kick off the start from the beginning. From anywhere that you have a form, the goal is to block bots, right? You don't want them to enter into your system. There's ways that we can mitigate it once they're in the system, but the first approach, it's a multi-layer approach to, fight against these bots. But the first approach really is to block the forms from receiving it. So reCAPTCHA, a Google tool, now has version 2 or version 3. Version 3 is invisible. So if you don't want to ruin the customer experience with one of those pop-up boxes, you can enable reCAPTCHA v3. And there's many ways that you can do that. You can enable it through the CMS of your website, through Google Tag Manager, or through Google Tag Manager on your cloud page. Another way, of course, which you should always have, is encryption. And after reading some of the slides from our later presenters, you'll hear more about that later. Next is how to handle the bot attacks once they do happen. So we have a couple of measures. One is a honeypot, and then also there are some spam suppression techniques. Again, the goal is to block them, but if they do enter into your system, there are ways to handle it. And what you really want to do is make sure that your domain health stays, that you're still a viable domain at the end of any attack, or just in general. So I've given some tools on how to check to see if you're on a blacklist, or if your IPv6 and different internet protocols are up to date, which are also very important. And I think Salesforce would really appreciate that if you would keep everything up to date. So okay, so if you use forms on your website, you'll need protection from spam. Here's some tips so that you can be your own spam SWAT team. Again, the best method to combat the attacks is to block them, but you may get entries regardless. And so this multi-pronged approach really is block, quarantine, and suppress. Okay, so what happens if spam gets into your database? You want to quarantine and suppress them. So there's a couple of options. If you're not familiar with the honeypot, it's basically a hidden field on your form that only bots will find. So it's not visible to your eye, but on the back end, if they're infiltrating your system, most bots, as they progress and get smarter, will probably miss your honeypot. But for the, first gen attacks, the honeypot can capture them, and it does a pretty good job. So I'll talk more about that. And then also identifying the pattern of bots for suppression, for spam suppression. If you can identify the patterns of your bots, you can create SQL and suppress them from entering your system. And we'll go into that a little further. Okay, so what is the honeypot? Again, it's the hidden field. How do you implement it? You add the hidden field to your, sorry, I said hidden form. You add the hidden field to your form and then to your data extension. So, let's say you just ask a question that's like your form. So it's not too far off for, so first name, last name, you could put middle name, the bot just sees the field and will fill it out. And then what you want to do is suppress them before they even get into your data extension. If you have a live journey, automation, anything that runs hourly or triggered by an event. So the goal would be to run this, as often as you can without suppressing the system or straining the system too much. So I usually set hourly automations to quarantine, depending on the situation. Okay, so how do you identify the patterns of your bots? Here's 3 tips. If there's 4 or more uppercase or lowercase letters in a field, it's probably a bot. We call that mixed case. If there's the same name in the first and last name field, it's probably a bot. If you have an HTTPS or .com in the first and last name, most likely a bot. There's also different domains that you can identify, like not that you want to suppress any specific country or region of bots, but if you look, there's some lists of domains that are highly spammed, and so you can just do a quick Google search or chat GBT and it'll tell you. Once you've identified the bot patterns, you're going to write SQL to identify the records and remove from your entry data extensions, your source data extensions, and then again on your all subscribers if they hit your all subscribers. Okay, so your domain health. If you know you've been attacked by bots and the problem doesn't get remedied, your domain health is at risk. Your IP and sending domains could be affected. In worst case, you have to get a new domain or sender authenticated package. The bots will keep attacking if they know there's a way in. It doesn't stop. You get put on more lists and more lists. So here's a couple of tools to check your domain health. mxtoolbox.com, if you're not familiar, it's a great domain for you to check your CNAMEs, your DMARCs, everything you need for email marketing, and then internet.nl, and that gives you your security checks.
Hi everyone, my name is Pascal. I am a marketing cloud consultant in Australia. I do a lot of work where I get asked to come in and look at what some other people have done and add some additional functionality, usually when they've been going for a while. So as a result, I see a number of things that I thought I'd talk about today. First one is, I think people forget that cloud pages can have a really high level of access. So if you're running code on a cloud page, it can do a lot of things. This is why so many people are talking about them. We've talked a lot about, what you should do, but to me, it's important because usually a cloud page can touch most things within your system. Specifically, one of the things that people pay very little attention to normally is the Marketing Cloud Connect user on the Salesforce end. If you're using Core as well, many people, from my experience, will use a system administrator profile on the Sales Cloud end. And so suddenly you have a cloud page that can basically be a system administrator on your Salesforce instance. It doesn't have to be that high. You can use a restricted user for it, and you can use that new license that Salesforce has for that Marketing Cloud Connect user now. So I highly recommend doing that so that you limit the damage. Obviously, you're going to do everything else you've talked about today, so you won't need to, but it's nice to have that level of security in there so that if you do make a mistake somewhere, you reduce the potential impact. I think this is super important because there's a lot that can be done in there. Now, that was the first tip. Second tip, there's been a lot of conversations about this already, but I cannot tell you how many times I have looked at a customer account that's been implemented previously, and I see that the people who did the implementation have left some of the treat as content HTTP gets calls in there. Obviously, a lot of us do this when we're doing development. The reason that we do it is that it's slow to update a cloud page. When you're testing, you publish it, it takes 10, 15 minutes to update. And so to speed up our development cycles, we use this treat as content HTTP gets in the middle. However, what I have found is that the implementation is finished or the page has gone live and that call is still in there. And when you do that, what you've effectively done is you've given someone else access to your system. Even if you've removed their access, if you're still loading something from their website, from their Dropbox or their GitHub, it's still there. So you really want to make sure that you migrate the code off that if you don't need it to be there, or if it's from somewhere you trust, maybe somewhere you control. Because otherwise, that remote person that is running that other site that you're loading from has access to run things as yourself. And as we've talked about before, cloud pages have a high level of access. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I actually recommend just checking for that regularly, because if I find it keeps creeping back in. People add a new cloud page to do a bit of testing, and then that just stays there. Next thing you know, it's in production. You're sending emails that are linking to this. There's hundreds of people loading it, and you don't really controlling what's happening. So I think this is a really important one to have as well. My last tip is something I've seen a couple of times now, which I find really scary. If you want to write to Salesforce through the Salesforce connector from a cloud page the way the majority of people do this is they use a treat as content block, and they have some AMP script in there, because AMP scripts helps you connect to Marketing Cloud Connect. Right? It lets you write to the Salesforce objects. And so very often people have a bit of code generated AMP script in their SSJS, which they then call through treat as content. If you do this, you must bind your variables. So there's a function that's provided for this called variable.set. I have the example there. If you call that, then you will have now an AMP script variable with @myvar available, right? That's the first argument to variable set. I have no idea why so many people have missed this. If you don't do this and you just randomly put code into your AMP script, you are actually allowing old school SQL injections to be possible in your sites. I've seen multiple people do this. It's really scary because you're giving somebody access to write to your Salesforce instance through URL parameters if you're not careful with how you do this. Now, obviously, you're not going to do this anymore, and you're going to be very careful about parameters and so on with all the encryption that we've talked about from others, making sure that your URLs are safe. But beyond all of that, just make sure that that's not happening, because you can literally do a SQL injection attack there like we used to have to deal with 10, 15 years ago. And people don't realize that they've recreated the same problem here by using this combination of treat as content with AMP script in there. So another thing to watch out for. These three things for me are the ones that I see the most often that I would like to stop. A lot of the other tips in this presentation are actually really good as well, and they're things that I would encourage all of you to do. But these three for me are the high priority ones that I just keep seeing that are actually high risk, not best practice.
Hi. So I am Genna Matson. I am a Salesforce Marketing Cloud architect. Data is my jam, and I like securing it. So we're going to talk quite a little bit about that today on my slide here. And I'm kind of piggybacking off some of the other ideas that Pascal and Dee and Ivan already presented. First off, if you're doing a user audit, consider programming it and making sure you're checking and running that audit on a regular basis. You can automate a user audit pretty easily using WS Proxy and an automation in Salesforce Marketing Cloud to pop out who all is using your org, who all has access, including all the applications that are accessing your org and when they're accessing your org. Disabling those on a regular basis, disabling those that are no longer needed, that are no longer using it, or that haven't accessed it in a certain period of time is strongly recommended. I know there are some timeout functions that you can set in your setup area, in your admin area in Salesforce Marketing Cloud, but go ahead and put a double check on that and consider programming an audit on a regular basis just to see who's accessing your org. And funny story, the reason I recommend doing that is because if you don't disable a user that might have been let go and might not be happy, they might decide to go into your org and have fun. And yes, I have seen this happen before. So make sure you're auditing your accounts. All right. So also be sure you're using you're using your functions for AMP script and SSJS correctly, just as Pascal just mentioned quite a bit. One of my favorite things to do is clean a dumpster fire. And one thing that I come up against is the incorrect usage of specifically the Cloud Pages URL function. Folks like to stuff system attributes in there, like subscriber key and email address and job ID and things like that, that are actually passed through the system on the platform using that function natively. You don't have to stuff those parameters into that function. The function or the cloud page will pass all of that information through the URL or through the cloud page function, URLs function, through in the query parameter for you, or in the query, the URL query string for you. So you can retrieve it on your cloud page there. So just make sure you're using your functions correctly. Be sure you're using code resources for data movements and not using just AJAX calls in your cloud pages in the DOM. Code resources are there for a reason. It helps protect your code and the ability to inject data into your data extensions or your databases through cloud pages. Like Pascal was just saying, cloud pages are a high risk area where if a bad actor gains access to one of your cloud pages, they can do a lot of damage to your org and do a lot of damage upstream also to core if you're using any sort of data connectors. In Marketing Cloud, only store data that is used for communications. Someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Ivan, that if you're going to store passwords in a data extension, make sure you encode it or encrypt it. Do that for all your data that is PII or that you might be concerned about somebody gaining access to or being able to change. If it doesn't need to be used in a communication or for querying an audience or whatever reason you need it, don't use it. Make use of data retention policies and deletion policies to ensure that the data in your platform is only being used for communication purposes or for tracking purposes, whatever you need it for. You don't have to store that data long term. You can keep it in there only for whenever you need it and then push it out. And I know that's a lot of processing, but it will secure your data and make sure that you don't compromise it in any way. And lastly, I had to put this on there. Hyperforce is coming. It's rolling out to the States first. Very, very excited about this. We'll probably chat about this a little bit later on, so I won't take up a lot of time on this topic. But it is rolling out to the States. I've already seen the email notifications coming out around it for certain orgs. And that is going to help secure our data even more because it's going to keep our data in our country. You know, it's going to be tenant specific. So that's a really good thing, especially for Australia and healthcare and finance. And I wish you guys were getting it first.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Hi, all. This is Himanshu, or He-Man. I'm a Salesforce Marketing Cloud architect. I've been in the Salesforce or Marketing Cloud ecosystem for over 12 years now. Similar to Genna, data is one of my favorite topics as well. And I'm sure listening to some of these awesome speakers already and some of the stuff you'll be listening later, there's a lot to learn. It might raise a lot of concerns or don't be scared. However, I would like you to take a step back and think about what level of data are you storing in the system? Do you need the white house level security for a modest home? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it's important to understand what you're storing and why you need it. You think about the ROI on the effort to implement and maintain the security, parameters around your org. Look at what data are you unnecessarily storing. Like Genna mentioned, just keep communication related data. Why do you need every single information about your subscribers or your contacts or your leads into the system? There could be a lot of sensitive or PII data in there. Always ask yourself, will I need this data after X number of days or months? And if so, can it be sourced from the CRM or ERP or another connected sources instead? So why keep the onus on yourself in Marketing Cloud if the data is going to be available? Otherwise, you can always use it later from there. Also, think about the data breaches that have happened in the recent past from Twitter, Deutsche Bank, Latitude Financial or G Money, to Optus or MyGov here in Australia. There have been data stored there from 2005 or before. When I look at a lot of accounts, yes, because Marketing Cloud does not or so far does not charge you for data, you keep the data there. You just don't worry about it. But at some point, you'll be doing an audit to find out what level of data do I continue to store there for no reason. Remember, contact delete will only clean the sendable data extensions. You'll still have your non-sendable data extensions still holding that data. And then think about, will you sleep easy or prioritize differently if you don't have that level of sensitive data in your account? One of the solutions there to just have a look or to get an idea of how much data you're storing is if you go to your parent business unit and download the storage details. It's under setup, under matrix, on the left hand or center of the page. It'll give you a CSV file that'll look something like this. It tells you which business unit, which MID, which data retention policy has been applied, how much data is stored there, number of records, and that might be a starting point to find out, okay, how much of unnecessary data have I been using or storing. You'll be able to identify some of the larger objects that have been sitting. It might just be a never-ending send log. So that is something to look out for. And then obviously deciding on a shorter or longer retention policy periods based on how valid that data is going to be for me and what use do I have in Marketing Cloud for it. Next slide, please, Matt. So just talking a little bit more on the other things that you could be doing. Again, some of the speakers have already covered deactivating all users, disgruntled employees, and whatnot. Auditing the whitelisted IPs on your account as well. There are so many accounts that I see which have a folder dedicated for archiving, and it's called archive. Why do you need it? It's called archive. So many temporary and test DE folders. Using the data retention policy either at a record level or a DE level. So you can choose to remove the old records after a certain point. A tip there is that the setting applies to the created date of that. If you're using an individual record, it is at a record level. So think of a Salesforce object. There is a created date for every record. There is a last modified for every record. If I created that record or that entered the data extension 2 years ago and has a retention policy of 2 years, it will get deleted today, even if it was modified yesterday. So it's based on the created date. So yeah, retention period can be after so many months, years, or days, or on a particular date that you know that the data is no longer relevant. That was it for me. Thank you.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you, Matt. I'm visible. Am I audible, right?
The video is audible. Yep.
Got it. Hi, hello everybody. My name is Aman Batra. I'm based out of India, right? It's 2 o'clock at my time, so I'm feeling a bit dizzy, but I'll try my best to deliver everything I have in the presentation today. I have been into Salesforce and Marketing Cloud space for 6 years or so now. I've worked with UNICEF as an architect, Marketing Cloud architect. Currently, I run a Salesforce Marketing Cloud consulting firm. It's a small team of 10 based out of India. That's about me. My topic today is it's quite different from what other speakers had today, which also says it might not be as interesting as them, but it's about single sign-on, its implementation, and best practices and tips for the single sign-on in Salesforce Marketing Cloud. On the screen, you can see there is a GIF which shows how streamlined and the ease the single sign-on implementation provides to the user, and how much friction it reduces in the login process. Can you go back to the next slide, Matt? But it's quite a different on your screen. Next slide. Got it. So starting, I have a 6.6 tips on the single sign-on implementation and usage tips. Starting with, make sure you understand provider, its configuration, and what all features, functionality it's required, and its prerequisite before you start implementing the single sign-on for Marketing Cloud. Next would be, this is very essential and important, periodically review access controls. There will be times where the user will change its role, or he might leave the organization. It's very important that you periodically review what roles he has in the single sign-on, and what other tools he have access to. And if he is out of the organization, make sure it's disabled at both the identity provider, which could be Okta, which could be Azure, and as well as the users should be disabled inside Marketing Cloud. So that's something that needs to be considered once it's implemented. Third pointer I have is the training for the users who will be using the single sign-on, because at times they will struggle. So it's very important, once the single sign-on is set up, a detailed training is provided and it's documented, so they can review it as and when they need assistance, and make sure they also know the point of contact in case when they are utilizing the single sign-on. Fourth and important step is documentation. And here, when I say documentation, I mean the documentation of the creation of SSO user, single sign-on user, because it would be a bit different than creation of a regular user. You need to know the single sign-on ID, which you need to configure in the Marketing Cloud user creation. You need to know the right groups which you will use to create the user inside your identity provider. So make sure all the steps you need, the user need to take inside Marketing Cloud and inside identity provider. So even if your role changes, shifts, or you're not available to create the user, somebody else is able to easily take over and do that on behalf of you. Fifth, and that's something that I myself have suffered, because I have implemented SSO for some of the clients, and that's something we have dealt with. And we realized after paying the price, make sure there is a contingency plan available, because mistakes or unhappenings are inevitable, especially in tech. So make sure if someday single sign-on stops working, fail to work, that could be from identity provider or that could be from Marketing Cloud side. Make sure there's a backup plan that will mostly be a backup user created inside Marketing Cloud, which does not have SSO enabled. So a user for SSO without SSO, where you can log in using just regular username and password. So that will be a contingency plan. Sixth and last one is that make sure you maintain audit logs. So in case, so you can evaluate and review those logs end of the month, or maybe once a quarter, and evaluate and see if you are able to see any patterns. There could be times where you can see some of the users are struggling to log in, or see field login attempts multiple times, and those could be your opportunity to spot and figure out what's going wrong with those users. You can talk to them and try to highlight or understand what the issue is actually. So these are my 6 tips. If there are no questions in the chat, I hand it over back to Matt.
Loving it. Thank you. So I do have slide progression here, so I will count you through, Matt, and we can go through the slides. And just as Aman just said, please do put your questions into the chat as well. We'll come back. We've still got 15 minutes at the end of this to come back and answer your questions and cycle back through the presenters if you had anything that you heard today that you want to go back and hear. But I do have a few tips today. So I'm going to jump in because hi, Cam, and you can figure it out later if you don't know who I am. So my first tip for today is don't store your API credentials in plain text. This goes for emails, for cloud pages, for data extensions. You've heard this tip already today. Don't store your API credentials in plain text. If you wouldn't mind giving a click for me, the solution here is you can actually use the AMP script encrypt symmetric methodologies. I think this was also mentioned earlier. I've got a video on this, and it goes through how you can create API credentials inside Marketing Cloud, but also you can use external ones as well. You can use the AMP script function to encrypt those values, and then use the encrypted values as your text in your cloud page, your SSJS scripts or otherwise. That way, if a user comes along and is to copy your content, which of course, when you have contractors who come into your business, they may in fact take copies and put them on their desktop or otherwise, they won't have your raw API credentials. They will have the encrypted credentials, but that will do them no good unless they are logged in and using the exact correct IV, salt, and password for the decrypt symmetric process. So it's a much safer way of storing your environmental values in Marketing Cloud. Next one down is sharing FTP credentials. Don't do it. Don't share your credentials, because when you share credentials, you open the risk to having someone, as we've heard before in this call already, someone who may leave the business and take those credentials with them. And as Genna mentioned, there are some individuals who may choose to come back and play around after they've left the company. And a lot of the time I see FTP credentials are actually left open and don't have a password expiry. And so sometimes those individuals may be walking away with a never expiring FTP credential. So don't do it. My tip of how to get around this, if you wouldn't mind clicking for me, is to use your 10 FTP accounts. It's no longer just the 3 or 5. We've now got 10 per MID. So you actually have the ability to create a lot of accounts. Now, for those of you who may be thinking, well, hang on, I've got more than 10 team members, I'll ask you this. If you need more than 10 licenses per BU, check your internal process. Chances are you don't actually need 10 users for each MID to be connecting to the FTP. It should be just a handful of key users, and change your internal process. If you do need to have other users getting access to the FTP, make an internal process instead to have them ferry the files to a key user who has those FTP credentials. And that way you're not going to be opening yourself up to people taking credentials with them. My next tip is, when it comes to FTP, don't use the password only option for your FTP credentials. A lot of FTP ones here. Password only means it's going to be just like your login for Marketing Cloud. It's just a password. And passwords are really, really easy to copy and paste and transfer around. And particularly for those instances that have set up the do not expire FTP credentials, that plus password only, big, big risk. Instead, the solution here is use your SSH keys. Thank you, Matt. You can instead start a SSH key instead. You can go into your key management under setup and create an SSH key. Use this particularly for your server-to-server integrations. And the reason I say this is your server-to-server is when you're sending data from an external process into Marketing Cloud or from Marketing Cloud externally, and you don't want to have to be cycling through those passwords every 30 or 90 days, right? That's a bit too much difficulty to play with. So make an SSH key for those S2S integrations, and that way you can set and forget them. Particularly if you use a really good encryption for the SSH key, maybe come back once a year or so just to make sure you can cycle those keys for data security. But if no human hands are touching those keys, you shouldn't be too worried about having to recycle them. You can also use SSH keys for your user accounts. I do recommend that as well. It is just one additional layer of security for your end users. It's a bit more fiddly, so make sure that you have users who know what they're doing. Again, I've got some videos on this if you ever are curious. Next one down is, I think, my favorite one to talk about, because it's one that appears that not many people knew about. I've known about this one for a long, long time, and it's actually, if you know where to find it on the internet, you will find plenty of documentation on it. But it's SK injection, or subscriber key injection on your cloud pages. I thought it was a well-known fact, turns out not. But your cloud pages have a hidden attribute in the URL called SK. If you go to any cloud page and you type in SK equals and you put a value in there, that impersonates the subscriber key. Super useful when you're developing your cloud pages, when you're making preference centers. It means that you can impersonate a subscriber key without having to actually send an email to the subscriber and then have them click on the link. You can actually impersonate them, which is great. It's a cool function. It's a great feature, especially if you ever want to do more than just preference pages and do some really cool integrations with code resources instead. But just like all features, just like all really cool functions, they're also vectors for attack if not locked properly. I like the analogy, your sunroof in your car is a great feature until you leave it open. And now it's a vector for getting your things stolen from your car. So like all things, the trick here is to lock it down. And if you do click for me there, Matt, the solution here is you can actually use the query parameter function in AMP-script. You can also do the same thing in server-side JavaScript to listen for the presence of the SK parameter in the URL string. Now, of course, when you use the underscore subscriber key or % subscriber key as your personalization field, that's going to render the subscriber key if it is a subscriber context being rendered. But if the SK parameter is found in the URL, and it shouldn't be there, particularly if you've coded around it, then that means someone's trying to brute force their way into your cloud page. So if subscriber key value is set and the SK parameter is set, someone's trying to break their way in. So make a little if statement, make a little check with your query parameter to block them out. Again, it's a great feature, the SK function, just like a sunroof or your front door for your house. It's a great feature. Just make sure you lock it. So people who you don't want coming in don't come into your house, kind of stuff, right? All right, I've got 2 more to go. My tip number 5, don't trust apps. Don't trust apps. Just like all things that use credentials to access Marketing Cloud, if you've got a third-party app, which is getting access to your Marketing Cloud, this includes apps downloaded from the App Store, this includes Chrome extensions, everything, and all of the above, it's connecting to your instance, just like a user would, which means it can do things that a user could do. And the things that a user can do, of course, is to look at your data extensions, look at your emails, that's fine. But if you've got cloud pages, or emails, or SSJS scripts in Automation Studio that have got those free text credentials, those plain text credentials we talked about in number 1, then a user who can just read your instance can straight away copy that code and they could run it in Postman because those credentials are free text. So be very careful when you provide access from external applications to read into Marketing Cloud. And this is just read too. Writing is even more dangerous. But even just reading, because there's so many things that we forget as marketers who are in there all day long, that even just picking up some data extension names, even just picking up some of the code that exists in this SSJS or cloud pages could be run maliciously and could cause some irreparable damage. Now, of course, the key here to overcome this is have your IT security team go through and have a quick look. If you do have a security team, they should be doing this anyway. That's probably part of what their job is. But make sure you provide them with the links to the app and some information about it, and they can go through and review it for themselves. If you haven't got an IT security team, or if you're a smaller operation, then make sure you read the terms and conditions and you understand what's happening with this app. And again, this goes for all apps, my own SFMC companion included. Make sure you know what it's doing before you give it permission to do things in your instance. Again, the risk here is that you're creating a window, creating a front door for code to read things inside your instance. Make sure you know who you're letting in. And lastly, I think you've already heard this one, but lock your data extensions from alteration or deletion. I have myself had to stay awake for about 32 hours straight because I accidentally clicked the wrong data extension, then clicked delete, and that muscle memory kicked in, like, yes, delete, delete, delete. It's gone. And then it was gone. It was a key customer view. It was the central data extension for the entire instance, and I did delete. Not all of us have done it. Please don't all do it. But once you've done it, you'll know. You'll have that feeling in your heart forever. So the way to stop that from happening is go into that data extension, go into the set permissions section, and make sure that users cannot alter or delete that data extension. Don't do it for all your data extensions, of course, but for your key ones, your main data coming in or going out from the instance that you really need for the instance to run, lock those ones down. Now, of course, you can click on to the next one there, Matt, as well for the solution. It's to user permissions. Now, be aware, though, when you do this, any filters that you make from those data extensions will inherit that same permission set. So if you are using a central customer view or a marketing customer view data extension for your end users to filter on day by day to create their sendable data extensions, be aware it's going to adopt that can't delete function. So you will have to go into that filter, change permissions, remove the deletion clause, and so on. It's a little bit of extra work, but it will protect you from the accidental deletion. And the amount of hours you will spend trying to re-get that data if you do accidentally delete versus the inconvenience of spending 30 seconds to unlock it, trust me, put the locks on. It'll save you a lot of time and a lot of stress. And that's my 6.
So much enjoy the sunroof analogy there, Cam. Hey, just to wrap up, just really quickly, and before we go to Q&A, and also thank you so much for sharing links about the blog, and there's a lot of great tips there, and the best way to go through that's just to go through what Ivan shared. D, bot attacks. Wouldn't have thought about that. Pascal, getting the user right. Cloud pages are powerful, and something that came to my mind is you've got to treat content as having that content block on can also affect performance, because if the system's dependent, treat content as HTML or whatever it was, but if it's on, it can affect performance because the Marketing Cloud then becomes dependent upon an external system. So just listening to what you're saying there is just gold. Rashmu, I think what you said about will you sleep at night, I know I do, and it's a bit like I can relate to what Cameron said about being paranoid about the buttons you press. But the last thing I know I think about before I go to sleep is what are the best practices? Am I a good data steward? Do I do the things right that I need to do? Whether it's Marketing Cloud or whatever, I think we all think about that. So always have that at the fore of your mind. Aman, thank you for joining us at such an early hour. The things that resonated, at least with me, was documentation and having that contingency plan, because if we do have to panic about getting stuff sorted out so that people have got access, let's make that panic easy. And let's have a contingency plan. Let's document that process out, because don't want to let mistakes happen when we're not thinking about it too well. And Cameron, those sunroofs are there for a reason, to be closed, I suppose, but I think we've all left them open. Watch Cam's videos for more. Don't make your marketing cloud a black box, and don't make it easy for people to make a mess of your marketing cloud. I think that's the takeaways I got there. Well, there's a question there. And I'm hopeless with names. My apologies, but I'll give it a go. Maheko, does Salesforce have any mechanism to prevent SQL injection? If not, how much is it vulnerable to SQL injection? It's open to the panel to answer that question.
So
I think. Sorry.
Go, Genna.
Nope. You
No,
go
you
ahead. No, you go, dude.
No, you hang up. No, you hang up. Look, from the marketing cloud side, look, you cannot inject SQL technically. There is no direct path from, well, I'd key your thoughts, Genna, but you can't go directly from the browser and email directly into SQL. The SQL injection colloquialism that I think we've been using here is that functions of SQL through things like your AMP script lookup rows, those kind of functions, they're not technically SQL, but they are, of course, in the background. Those are what we talk about when we talk about SQL injection. The example here being that a preference page, if you are leaving that SK attribute, or if you're leveraging that attribute, for example, to return back the correct subscriber's information, by changing that SK value, you can change the subscriber context, which means you can then retrieve subscribers' information, like their first name, last name, maybe it's email address or birthday, who knows what else you're capturing on your preference page. But likewise, if you allow for them to update their details on that page, you can then allow a bad actor to add their own information onto that cloud page and then put it through. The SQL injection otherwise would be seen as you're not securing or sanitizing your form values, which means that on your preference page, you are not sanitizing the values that are being put into your code. The good news is, though, again, there is no direct route from the cloud page to your data extension. It must go through AMP script, which does have some protections involved, but I would not leverage those as your only line of defense. I would still do some basic special character checks, some basic length checks, and some basic keyword checks. That'll be probably enough for most preference pages, assuming you're not allowing a user to change everything about their personality on your preference page. But those are a few ways you can defend yourself against it. Again, the direct SQL injection, not so much, but vicariously through other functions of the Marketing Cloud platform, there are vulnerabilities if you're not secure.
Well, and so yes, I was exactly where I was going with, especially with SSJS and other forms of JavaScript, Node. Other people using external libraries and things like that in their cloud pages can open up vulnerabilities. I see it all the time. Cloud pages is probably the most vulnerable area for SQL injection. But also your apps, your third-party apps, like you were talking about, Cam. That is just, you are opening all kinds of gateways and doors, even apps hosted on App Exchange and extensions. That is a very vulnerable, that's a sweet spot for anybody looking to mess around with a database, retrieve data from it, or inject data into your database to corrupt it. So,
I just want to add treat as content is a way to bypass some of these security things. So if you're using treat as content, you need to actually watch what you're doing, not just copy paste code of the internet.
And HTTP GET, that's another one.
Pascal, did you just mention copy and pasting code off the internet?
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned that, have we? Or had we?
No, we haven't. That's a very good one.
But yeah, no, there's so much good code out there. People have contributed. But yeah, please read what you're actually putting in the Marketing Cloud. Understand. It's not just Marketing Cloud, anywhere. Please understand what you're copying in before you just blindly copy it in. We don't have any more questions in the deck there. or not in the deck, in the chat, we might as well wrap it up. Oh, we've got a we're just starting our thank yous then. Thank you, everyone. And let's read out some of these things. Thank you, Amanda Turner, Matthew Brulette, Adam Ridgway. Thanks. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your tips. Please go to the link that we shared earlier on, and I'll put that up in the slide notes when we do the record for this page. But please go to the link and share your comments about your favorite tip. Awesome, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you,
all.
everybody. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.